The wind on the wall never tired, and in the small hours before dawn it sang in the stones like an old restless thing. Jon stood on the eastern rampart with his hands wrapped around a leather-cupped lantern and watched the black line of the haunted forest pulsing with the breath of winter. Ghost pressed against his thigh, a pale shadow, ears pricked at the moving dark below. When Jon drew air, it tasted like iron and pine and the sour memory of smoke. When he let it go, it came out white under the stars. He had died here. Sometimes he remembered the blades sliding in without pain. Sometimes he remembered only the snow falling and the face of a boy who loved him looking more afraid than he'd ever seen him. He remembered darkness that was soft, not cold, and a great quiet that had been almost kind. Then he remembered waking to the stink of wet wool and wood ash and the glare of torchlight and Melisandre's red eyes, which were not kind at all. "You're not the only one up early," Davos said, boots thudding softly on the timber walk. He kept his hands under his armpits, hunched into a patched black cloak. "The cooks are murdering oats as we speak, and Tormund's men were already outside breaking ice for their morning. Whatever it is they do with axes at this hour. If they don't swing them for a day, their hands grow lonely," Jon said, and the joke, simple as it was, warmed him. Davos followed his gaze to the darkness beyond the wall. "You should sleep." "I did." For 2 hours, his body lying still while his thoughts ran like wolves. "Sansa says we cannot wait. Ramsay will not. Every day we dither, he tightens his hold on Winterfell, and the north grows used to the wrong banners flying." Davos made a small sound in his throat. "We make ready and then we go. But no time to keep polishing our doubts. The snow won't listen." Jon touched Ghost's ears and felt the twitch of quick blood beneath the fur. "If the Karstarks and Umbers stand with us, half the north remembers how to be itself." "Half and half is not a whole," Davos said and rubbed his nose, which was red with cold. "But it would be a start I'd drink to. We'll need more than starts before it's done." He left Jon with the wind and his own stubborn quiet. Hours later, when light washed the world to a faded blue and the ravens gossiped on their perches, a horn sounded from the gate. Not the alarm, but the long low note that meant guests. The wall ate every sound. Even that horn came up the stairs as if from another life. By the time Jon reached the yard, the gates were opening, hinges screaming, the portcullis rattling like teeth. Snow eddied in, and with it a small crooked caravan. A dozen riders with cloaks the color of old slate. 3 sleds heavy with chests, a girl at their center with a hood drawn up. They carried no banners. The horses were shaggy little mountain things with breath like steaming linen. Tormund ambled into the yard with his hair a flaming tangle and a grin that showed a lost tooth. "More crows," he called. "Or other cold fools? Carhold?" the girl said, easing back her hood. She was younger than Jon expected. A quick, narrow face, lips chapped to pale cracks, hair black as crow feathers braided under a fur cap. Her eyes were winter blue. She stared at Ghost for a heartbeat longer than most Southerners could stand. Then back to Jon. "Alice Karstark." Jon heard Davos draw a breath. The name walked out of old trouble. Rickard Karstark had been beheaded by Robb for murdering Lannister boys. His son Haryon had been lost to battles and prisons, his line tangled in intrigue. "You rode south without banners, Lady Alice. One can ride faster without a flag," she said. "And my uncle's banner is the wrong one." She swung down and staggered a little when her boots hit the icy stones. The men around her were watchful, hard-eyed. Not many. All wore the same look as their horses, a look that had gone without ease too long. "Bring them to the hall," Jon said, "and the horses to the warmest shelter we have." Inside, the shield hall was damp with the breath of too many men and the sweat of their gear, but a fire raged on the long hearth, and the smell of stewing oats worked like a simple charm. Sansa arrived as if pulled by a wire, her face pale with worry and wonder. She and Alice looked at one another as if measuring what it meant to stand across from a new future. Alice did not mince words. "Arnulf Karstark plans to wed me to his son Cregan, so they can claim Carhold in my name and then give it, and our swords, to the Boltons. He says Haryon is as good as dead. He calls me a warm body and a better road to warm rooms. I had to ride through 3 nights to get here. Tormund spat noisily in the rushes. Old men who want young wives forget winter takes even the hot-blooded. I don't know this Arnulf, but I'd wager he forgets how a young wife carries a knife. Alice flicked her eyes at him, wary, and when she looked back to Jon, there was a wild brightness pushing against her composure. If Karhold goes to Bolton's, then the sun on our black field becomes merely a decoration in Ramsay's hall. I won't have it. The Karstarks are not a ribbon to tie to a flayed man's spear. Help me keep our house, and we will help you take back yours. There it was, in simple truth, the kind he preferred. Lady Alice, Sansa said, stepping closer, voice even, almost warm. Your father was a proud man. He made a terrible choice and paid for it. But you don't carry his debt. You carry Karhold. We can make a better oath between us. And a better net, Jon said, thinking not of oaths but of how to catch Winterfell men in obligations that meant something when snow fell. If we legitimize your claim, if you stand as Lady of Karhold, will your men follow you? They will follow whoever feeds them and keeps them safe through winter. Alice's mouth tilted, almost a smile, but hard. And they will follow whoever promises to make them fear. And again, Ramsay will promise both, Davos said, and flay them for the skin to bind his parchment. Alice's gaze flicked to him and back to Jon. I didn't ride here for the weather. I rode because I heard you had a way of binding old wrongs in new thongs. Jon looked at Tormund, whose laugh came out thick as mead. She means the free folk. Word spreads. Word did. The North had always heard its own heart through rumor more than law. You came to the right place, Jon said. I won't give you to your uncle. I won't give your house to the Boltons. I ask a price, a binding. Your house has old blood. Mine has old blood. We make a knot of it. Not by taking your hand myself. I cannot. But by joining Karhold to allies who have no love for Ramsay and will bleed for you because you will bleed with them. Alice extended her jaw. Who? Sigorn, Tormund said with relish, already seeing the line of it. Magnar of then since Styr took an axe in the gift of a boy. Young, but his teeth are sharp and he's learning to wash. His folk are hard as ice and loyal as their own. They came south with raiders in their grandfather's tales, but they came south now to live, not to take. A marriage will make them stake their lives in Karhold. And your men will see that when knifing time comes, it's them and you against men who flay, not against a tower of your own with a new hearth lit. Alice's hands had stopped moving in her lap. You would mash a Karstark and a then together and call it bread. The old gods will have it if the hearts in the wood do, Jon said. And the law of guest right and oath will keep it sharp. I did something like it before at the wall when it seemed the only way to stop killing that didn't matter. It will make more enemies now, but fewer later. Sansa's expression tilted, an acknowledgement not of delight but of practicality. Davos rubbed at his beard. It won't be popular. It will be binding, Jon said, and that's what we need. Bring this Magnar, then, Alice said, chin high. I'll look him in the eyes. If they shine like a blade, I will take them. They brought Sigorn into the hall that afternoon, the young Magnar wary and proud in leathers patched with seal fur. His beard a rough red-brown that had not learned to be dignified. He was tall in the way the free folk could be when the cold didn't chew them down. His mouth was ugly until he smiled, and then it was less so. When he saw Alice, he did not leer as some men would, but gave her the same cool glance he might give a rival hunter. That counted. You don't flay? Alice asked him, tone dry. I don't wear another man's skin like a mummer, Sigorn said. And I don't give my wife to her uncle. We have uglier customs, but not that one. Tormund grunted approval. Sansa's lips thinned in a careful concealment of amusement. Davos made a small thoughtful noise that was as good as consent. Jon listened to the sound of the hall, the whisper of snow melting off boots, the crackle of the fire. The old gods will see this done before the heart tree, he said. In the godswood. There is no godswood here, Alice said quick, as if she might snatch the offer back. There is, Jon said, with a surprise of warmth at the thought. The Grove of Nine was not inside the wall but not far beyond it. A stand of white trees whose faces watched with a patience that made men uneasier than any scarlet priest. The watch had left it to the wild for generations out of habit and old caution. Jon had gone there often, and the rustle of the leaves at night was one of the few sounds that softened the hardness in him. "It's where I buried." He didn't finish. "We will go." They went in a shiver of breath and torchlight, the wind a hiss that moved like a cat around boots and ankles. The carved faces in the trees were painted with shadow. The streams ran warm in their beds, keeping a rim of frost at bay. Sansa stood a little apart, face pale as milk, hair the color of old leaves arranged under her hood, eyes like flint. She had grown so careful these past years that sometimes she seemed not to move at all and yet arrived at a different place. The vows were short. Alice and Sigorn spoke the words the old gods liked best, plain ones. Jon felt a strange pull as they did, as if strings loosened in some knot inside him to let the knot between them be tied. When Sigorn kissed Alice in the cold, their lips stuck for a second from the freeze and they both laughed. It made the watching men laugh too, not unkindly. That sound traveled up into the branches and sat there like a small good bird. After, Jon called for hot wine, and in the shield hall they drank to Karhold's sun, sharing its black within iron. There were grumbles in the corners. The old grudges did not die because a girl and a hunter said a few words. Yet when Alice spoke to the Karstark men, she did it with a strength that put spines into the speech. "This is how we keep from being meat," she said. "This is how we keep from being trophies. We do not choose the flayer's table to avoid sleeping with a man who eats seal. We choose a better fight, and we win it." They rode at first light 2 days later for Last Hearth. Jon would not let the Karstarks return to Karhold alone while Arnulf's men still sniffed around for an easy prize. And if the Umbers were to be won, it would not be by ink and wax. A man's face told more on a wood-planked hall floor than a raven ever could. Tormund took 100 of his best, men who knew how to move in snow like foxes. Davos rode with Sansa. Ghost shadowed them, a ghost truly in the gray spaces between trees. One came, slower than the rest, but Jon had insisted. Against a Bolton line there were few arguments as eloquent as a living giant. The road east bit like old steel. They went off-road when they could, using frozen streams as white highways, where horses threw bright chips of ice. The sky was the color of lead. Twice blackbirds followed them, but ghosts attentive. Unflicked, and the birds lost interest. They saw no bands of armed men until the second sundown, when Tormund stopped with his fist in the air and pointed to a stand of dark pines. He had smelled men before he saw them. The smell of wood smoke hid under the clean stink of snow. They found 5 bodies there, sprawled under a tree, all wearing bits of Karstark black and gray. Their hands were bound with cord. Their throats were cut neat. No flagging, quick killing. The cords were the expensive kind merchants liked to use for bundles. Arnulf's men, then, or those who wanted to look like them. Sansa knelt beside one and touched his cheek. The skin was already ice. "He was a boy," she said. "Older than I was when I left Winterfell. Younger than I am now." Jon closed the boy's eyes with 2 fingers. The wind vaulted over the treetops. He fixed his jaw before he spoke. "We keep moving. Whoever did this is moving too." They found the living evidence the next morning. 8 riders in hasty formation, blowing hard with effort to make the last hearth before the weather turned worse. Their leader wore a staghorn brooch that had been polished recently. Arnulf had visited Winterfell once when Jon was smaller, and the old man's son Cregan had been proud of that brooch and the way it made people look. Now it was pinned to a chest that rose and fell with stubborn, piggish breaths. They tried to run. Tormund's men brought them down like wolves bring down startled deer. Jon let the men with the red fingers do the handling. He had no patience for spitting and pleading. "Last hearth's not yours to gift," Jon told Cregan when the man had been trussed and his mouth wiped free of snow and blood. "Karhold either. You ride with the Boltons, so you're my enemy, unless you want to unmake that." Cregan spat again, short of Jon's boots. "A bastard speaks of gift and blood and law. I remember the day your father's lord, took my uncle's head. My father's son will take yours for the murders you ordered, Sansa said before Jon could answer, and the small iron in her voice made Cregan's eyes flick to her. If I were you, I'd save your spittle. You'll need water where you're going. Do you know who I am? Cregan said, baffled fury blooming in his face. Sansa looked at him the way one looks at a fly. A rag with a brooch that doesn't suit. They left the brooch on him so the last hearth would see who had been caught and might draw their own conclusions about which families were selling what. They put the 8 men on sleds and dragged them with the caravan, not gently. They reached the Umber's seat 50 miles later, passing burned fields, then fallow ones where pale stubble showed through snow like hair on a dead man's chin. Last hearth rose from the land like a fist. Its walls were squat and thick, built for winter more than glory, with long halls low to the ground to keep the heat. A headwind pushed against them, cold enough to bite through the fat and gristle of a man who had never learned to shiver. Riders came out to meet them, 20 of them, big men in layered furs, axes slung over backs as if those axes were a second spine. The man in front wore no helm. He had a broad face with a brow like a cliff and a beard braided into 2 ropes. He was not a small man by any measure, though his father had been named Great John in a moment of rough humor that stuck like pitch. Snow, he said, and another snow, if the gods are playing a joke on me. His gaze cut to Sansa. No, not a joke. Lady Sansa Stark. He bowed as much as a man like him could bow without his pride sliding off. Small Jon Umber, or just Umber, if we're past the time for jests. Umber, Jon said, and didn't smile at the line he'd been fed by fate. You know why we're here. Aye, the world's heard it. You mean to oust the bastard of Bolton and make your sister lady of her home again. In the meantime, you bring me... His eyes ticked to 1-1, lingering there mouth corking. A large guest. And others that my father died teaching me to distrust. Tormund spat a glob of phlegm that hissed when it hit snow. Your father may have died of pride or courage. I can't tell which from here. But he didn't die because of us. He died because of Lannisters, Umber said, a muscle jumping in his cheek. And the choice of a march and a battle that turned wrong. The world is a long hill of wrong turns. Now the hill is frozen and I'm sliding down it with everyone I know. The free folk ride with you. My folk have kept them out with broken spears and broken hands as long as we've had hands. You want me to shake their hands. The gods have a sense of humor after all. Sansa spoke before Jon could. Bright and cold. The gods do not. Men do. And surviving winter is an unfunny business. You don't have to like the men beside you to use their blades. We came because you've never had to be told that an oath is heavier than a belly and longer than a grudge. We came with one to offer and one to ask. Umber's mouth pulled tight. You learned to put words on an anvil, Lady Sansa. I hear them ringing. But there is a thing you don't know. I have a guest in my hall who makes you whole in a way your words cannot. I haven't told Ramsay Bolton about him. I haven't told anyone with a flayed man in their kit. I wasn't sure if I was keeping him or saving him. That made me a coward for 10 nights. Perhaps your arrival makes me something else. The name rose in Jon before he could stop it. Rickon, he said, and the sound broke like ice. Umber's eyes flinched, just barely. The big man's beard twitched. Aye, the little wolf. He came ragged from the hills with a wildling woman who could cut my men with her eyes. She said she'd take him anywhere I wanted, and I didn't know what I wanted. To spite Ramsay, to keep something good near my fire. To hold a Stark and feel like the world had not moved entirely out from under my feet. I've had him eating porridge and making faces at my dogs. He plays with sticks. He is a boy, and he belongs to you. Sansa's knees went weak and stiffened again so fast she almost stumbled. Jon saw that and wanted to reach for her, but his hands stayed on his reins. He had learned to hold himself stiff when the world bucked under him. You kept him safe, Sansa said, each word measured, deliberate, as if she were building a tower out of ice that could fall if she spoke too loud. You can make a list of reasons for it if you want to be proud. I don't care why. He is alive. Umber's eyes had the look of a man who had braced for a blow and didn't get it. He nodded once, hard. "Come in," he said. "We'll pour hot drink on your bones until they float." The hall of Last Hearth had a smell that Jon had not known he missed. Dogs, damp wool, and roasting meat. Big hounds sprawled near the fire, ears like pennants. Men scrubbed their hands and faces and put on shirts that had been mended as if mending were a ceremony. Children peered around doorposts. The banners in the rafters were dark with smoke. The giant that was the Umber's device glowered through soot lines at the world beneath. Rickon was exactly where a boy would be. He was under the long table with a dog. When Sansa called his name, he banged his head in his hurry to get out, and then came up with a face full of awe and confusion. He had grown taller, that miracle that boys perform even in winters with bad food. His hair had more tangle than sense. He stopped mid-run as if a hand had taken his shoulder. "Sansa?" he said in a small voice that went through Jon like a thought you try not to have. Sansa went to her knees. "You were a cub the last time," she said. And then there were no more words for a little while because Rickon was wrapped against her, and the world made a small circle around them in which there was nothing Ramsay could reach, nothing past that mattered. Osha watched from the hearth with eyes like flint chips and a knife at her belt. She was older and thinner. The scar along her forearm had been healed messy. When Jon came to her, she looked him up and down. "You died and lived again. Your eyes learned it. Good. I know what I owe you, Osha," he said, simple. "You owe the boy a life where he doesn't have to hide under tables," she said. "You and your Red Wolf sister." When Sansa looked up at that with a sudden stiffening, Osha shrugged a shoulder. "You didn't think we had names for you? You were a story that stuck in his mouth so he'd sleep. Red Wolf. He'd forget you in his dreams and wake crying. The dogs liked him. They knew enough." Umber poured hot wine and held it out to Jon. "Take it. It'll make the words easier." Jon took it and it burned like a small forge in his chest. "We came for you," he said to Rickon, and the boy grinned like a cut had been opened and light spilled out of it. "We also came with an ask. Your house stood with Robb. Your father raised a cup and bellowed the king in the north, loud enough to shake teeth. He was a loud man, your father, but he knew how to stand. I need your stand now. I need the Umbers." The hall made the sound big so everyone could hear it. Umber put his cup down. "With free folk thick as crows in your camp?" "With free folk thick as crows," Jon said, unflinching. "They'll take the front when we fight. They'll take the hardest road. They'll take the quarrels aimed at your back. They'll do it because I ask, and because they're not Ramsay's men either. We all like meat. None of us likes a flaying knife." A murmur ran through the hall. The men at the back shifted their weight. The dogs snorted. Umber's eyes moved over faces like a shepherd over a winter flock. "You'd say that even if I still had mind to hand the boy to Ramsay." "I would say it because it's true," Jon said. "But if you had that mind, you would not have told us he was here." Umber's mouth curved in a fraction of a smile. "Your tongue learned more than swords at the wall. It learned to watch men," Jon said. Umber cracked his knuckles, the sound like a door hinge. "All right, here's what we'll do. You ask me to swear. I'll swear. But understand me, I swear as an Umber. My father was not careful about loving. He loved men for being large and loud and not much else. I am careful in ways he was not. You give me a reason not to trust and I'll pull this oath right out of my chest and feed it to a dog. You make me a place at your fire and I'll put my back to your back and we'll let the snow bury the dead together." "Done," Jon said, and felt something lift inside him that had sat heavy ever since he'd woken up on a board and drawn breath like a man who'd been under water too long. "We march together." "And this boy?" Umber asked, cocking his head at Rickon, who had Sansa's sleeve in a trained grip as if he could anchor the world that way. "He rides with us," Sansa said at once, surprising Jon. "To gather the rest, to show them a Stark is not a letter and a memory. He will stand in the hall at Deepwood Motte and Bear Island and White Harbor and say his name. We will not hide our wolves while foxes roam." "You're your mother's daughter," Umber said, and the softness under that was the first he had shown. "She would have scolded me for keeping him. She would have said I know better than to put a boy under a bench while men drink. She would have been right, and I would have grunted and done it anyway because I'm a stubborn fool. All right, he rides with you. I'll send men I trust to guard him. You better be one of those men, Snow. I am too old to sing laments for children. I could have kept well if I had been better. I am one of those men, Jon said. They did not sleep much at last hearth that night. Osha sat with Tormund and ate, and half the hall watched that with amusement and concern as if two old cats had come to a strange peace. Sansa and Rickon whispered so long the candle at their table dripped its last until the wax puddled and went black. Davos wrote letters with the butt of his knife scraping in the ink to thicken it, his face as plain as a shield. Umber drank and did not grow raucous. He drank like a man measuring, not celebrating. At dawn they swore. The words were not pretty, but they were sharp. Umber cut his palm and pressed it against Jon's. Jon felt the sting and the heat of the blood mixing and thought of all the oaths he'd sworn since he was a boy, how each one had cut something away to make room for something else. When it was done, the hall breathed out as if another kind of weather had come inside. They were not gentle days that followed. Winter had swaggered into the north and spread its cloak over barns and hearts. But as the little army became a bigger one, a new sound traveled with them, the sound of men who were angry and not only afraid. At Carhold, Alice stood on the steps of her hall with Sigorn at her side and accepted the knee of men who had chased her a month before. She did it without triumph, which was how to do it if you wanted those men to put themselves between you and a spear later. At Bear Island, a small girl with more command in her chin than most lords had in their whole bodies agreed to send soldiers because Sansa and Jon looked her in the eye and spoke to her like someone who had healed herself on her own terms. At Deepwood Motte, Asha's sails were long gone, but the men there were not as committed to the Boltons as their letters had pretended. They knew a better wind when they felt it. At White Harbor, ravens flew and never came back, but fishermen along the Blazewater Bay offered carts and salted fish without asking for coin, which in winter is the only coin that counts. Ramsay's answer came in skin. They found it nailed to a tree near the road to Winterfell. A square of pale human hide with Bolton pink rivulets of blood running down over the bark. A message was cut into it. Come and see. The letters were crude, as if some child had been given a knife and told to practice. Sansa stared at it and then looked away quickly. Jon cut it down himself and gave it to the fire without words. That night he dreamed of the crypt beneath Winterfell, the smell of cold stone and candle wax, the Stone Kings watching with blind patience. He woke with his heart hammering and a taste of salt and ash on his tongue. Ghost lay with his head on Jon's boots, eyes open, seeing things in the dark that men did not. When they were 3 days from Winterfell, Davos come to him with a map tacked down on the snow by 3 throwing knives. He'll want you to run at him, Davos said, tapping a knife hilt near a scribble marking Winterfell's walls. He'll want your blood up and your mind away. He'll set skirmishers to gnaw at your edges. Then he'll will cavalry into your flank. That should make you break ranks. Then his lines will tighten. Bastard trick for a bastard. He plays the same game with people that he plays with hounds, Sansa said. He lets them run, he jerks them, he makes them dance to shame themselves. He is patient when it means he can relish pain. We don't dance, Jon said. We plant. We make him come to us. We set the ground in front of him with teeth. We make a mouth in the earth that chews his horses. We are not at the Dreadfort. The land here is ours to know. Umber. The big man scratched at his beard, eyeing the slopes and the folds of the land drawn in crude charcoal lines. There's a frozen slough here, he said, poking a thick finger at a narrow swale. Looks like nothing until you fall in it. We can make the ground worse. Break it up in a long curve. Hide it with a dusting of snow. The horses will hit it and go knee-deep, and the more that push, the more pile into the mess. If we shape our lines to curve and curve again, here and here, their rush cheeses itself to pieces. We can keep our foot in tight circles, shields locked. We learned to do that in the long winter, when raiders came with quick legs and got slower in our hedgehogs. Karstark's on the right, Alice said. Umber's on the left. Mormont's in the gap with their spears. They've hunted boar enough to know how to keep a beast off their bellies. Free folk in the vanguard. They won't stand with fear on their heels, but if fear is in front of them, they grow taller. And me in the center, Jon said. Davos behind to anchor with men who won't break when the ground turns red. 1-1 where the line is weakest. Sansa. I am not a soldier, she said before he could speak. I don't want to pretend to be, but I am not a thing to be stowed either. I'll be back with the baggage train to the west, where the land rises. If Ramsay breaks us, which he will not, I'll have riders ready to pull the wounded out under cover of dust and screaming. And I have sent riders on their own errand. What they bring may be late or too little or just in time. Do not count on them, but do not be surprised if you hear men singing the Vale's music before the day ends. Jon looked at her and tried to hide a smile and failed. You did not tell me. You have enough on you, she said. You don't need to juggle secrets as well as swords. Secrets don't like me, Jon said. They slip. They slip less with me, she said. And it was only later, long later, that Jon understood how much that had cost her to say. The night before the battle was a swallow of cold and quiet. The men slept badly, or pretended to sleep to do their duty to hope. Jon walked among them with Ghost and nodded to faces. Some of those faces had been at his side beyond the wall. Some had carried casks through snow in Carhold for Alice's insulted house. Some had never left their own villages before winter drove them into a world so large the stars looked like holes torn in a monstrous blanket. He wanted to tell them something wise. He had never been a man for speeches. He could do it when he must, but the words always seemed like paper compared to the stone of men's fear and hunger. He stopped at the circle of Karstark men. Alice had gathered into her own little hedge and said, "Tomorrow we do this so that when your children tell the tale, they speak of how their parents kept them alive on more than soup." Alice lifted her chin. "Tomorrow we remind my uncle that he is too old for the weather," she said, and a few men laughed, an iron little sound, and that was good too. Morning was a pale coin flipped by a stingy hand. The ground was hard enough that the horses stamped and blew and shook ice out of their manes. The world smelled like wood smoke and leather and something not unlike fear but with more salt in it. There was some distant screaming as the Boltons put on their banners. A sound like glee without joy. Ramsay came up with his men as if to a pageant, trumpets bleeding thin and weird in the cold air. His flayed men flags shook and blinked. He had more horse than Jon liked to see and fewer smiles on his foot than Jon had expected. Even a flayer's men do not always like the work of winter. Ramsay himself wore a cloak with a lining that flashed soft as a woman's hair when he turned. He rode a gray horse with careful hands. He had a face that would have been handsome if you scrubbed it of its cruelty, and because men are strange animals, some might have called him handsome anyway. He looked at Jon and then at Sansa farther back and grinned, and the grin did not belong on any human face in the world. He raised a gloved hand and flourished a parchment. "Shall we play letters?" he called. "I like letters." Jon said nothing. Sansa's mouth tightened, a line not to be crossed. Umber hawked and spat so hard, he seemed to be trying to empty himself of patience. Davos arranged the center and muttered something that sounded like a small prayer and a small curse together. Ramsay sent his first wave in like boys running into a cold lake to show their nerve. A rippling line of horse with shields bright as beetles' backs, lances held at angle. Jon let the horn blow the slow, heavy call, the one that made men lean back into their shields and set their spears just off the ground. The left bent back, the right held. The curved trench they had scraped across the open snow waited under its dusting. The horses hit it, and the first row stumbled and struggled and screamed as their legs went into cold mud that might as well have been a mouth. The second line slammed into them, and the third bunched behind, and then the wave of horse melted from shining motion into a lurching chaos of flailing legs and harness, and men drowned in snow because they couldn't move fast enough to breathe. Tormund led the free folk forward with an unlovely bellow, and axes swam down. 1-1 took 3 strokes for every one man had time for. The Mormonts in their small knots planted their spears and walls of hard, angry girls and hard, angry old men and younger men who had learned how to stand in a bear's shadow. On the right, Alice did not blow a horn. She shouted till her voice broke blood vessels under her skin. and the Karstarks held as if the snow were their mother and they had found their way to her skirts after too long lost. Ramsay sent foot then, angry and ashamed, and arrows. Arrows are like rain. The first drops make you flinch, the second make you decide whether to run. Men hunkered and Jon held the center. He had to stand still when the old thing in him that wanted to run forward, run or rush, as if one might drown the world in action, pulled at his bones. He remembered Ygritte's hair in the snow, red as an autumn leaf. He remembered his father before he was a secret and a throat cut and a grave marker. He remembered the faces of the men who had put knives into him and the way their hands had shaken after. This was a new world he was inside, a world where he could choose not to try to outrun his fear. He kept choosing for an hour and more. Ramsay adapted, which Jon had expected. He pulled his cavalry out and sent lines of foot at angles to try and wedge into the shifts and curves of the Stark line. When he found a seam, the flayed men dove in, and Jon could see the sparkle of them even through the smoke. But every time a wedge reached choking distance, a section of wildlings boiled backward into them, and every time an Umber lot wavered, Umber himself stepped into the open and fought like a man who had counted the blows he'd given and knew he had a lot owed to him. Once, Jon saw Alice slip on a patch of ice and go to one knee. Sigorn hauled her up by the back of her cloak and shoved her behind a shield with more gentleness than Jon had expected from a man who had called himself a hunter of men when they first met. The battle changed shape half a dozen times. Ramsay was patient more than he was brave, which is its own kind of courage. He would pull back and let men get their breath, and then he would push. Toward late day, he tried to gather enough horse to come around and bite Jonas's left flank clean off. Umber read the motion and roared and slammed into it with a wall of big men and bigger shields on foot, which is not how sensible men treat cavalry. They did it anyway. The horses balked and men fell, and Winter moved another step into Ramsay's lines. Jon could feel their moment coming. It was something in the way the snow carried sound, and something in the way his men's shoulders rolled and then set, and something in Ghost's slow stance alongside him, as if the animal could sniff through the wind and follow the scent of what must be done. He stood up in his stirrups and shouted like a boy again. Forward! The center moved. He did not run out alone to let Ramsay turn him into bait. He went with his men as if he had been sewn into their line and could not leave without tearing something essential. At first it was sludge and noise, and then they broke clean into a section of Bolton Foot where the commander had been watching the wrong portion of sky. The right hand of that wedge curled inward and decut, and suddenly they could see Winterfell's outer walls like teeth against the whitening afternoon. Jon felt something lift in his belly, not gladness but not grief, and he pushed harder and thought, I am not the boy who rode with Robb. I am not the man who broke his oath because a girl with hair like the heart of a torch looked at me and called me brave. I am not the dead boy. I am the living one. Then the horns came. He had heard that particular sound once before, in the snow under a different sky, in company he had not entirely loved then, and how strange it was that now he felt something like affection for the memory. It was the veil. The knights came over the ridge from the west like birds with iron on their bones, and for a heartbeat the afternoon was sudden glitter. Sansa sat on a hill with Davos near her and watched, hands tight on the rail of the sledge as if she held herself there physically. Hold! Jon shouted to his own that might be tempted to break ranks and race. Hold, let them pierce. Then we pour into the holes they make. The Vale did what they did well. Their spears came in long lines, their horses as sleek as the sea in summer. Ramsay's men, seeing their flanks go soft, had a moment where they remembered they were only men. Some broke too soon. Some starved for a better choice and died where they stood waiting for it. Jon's line surged with the freedom of someone opening an old wound and letting it bleed out the bad humor. He did not see the moment Ramsay decided to run. Some men saw it. The way he turned his gray horse as if he were considering a better angle and then realized there were no angles left that did not end in a wall. He pulled back with his guard toward Winterfell. The gates opened to swallow him. Jon did not have cause to chase. The plan had never been to spill men like grain in a panic for his blood. Yet as the gates shuddered shut, Jon felt something like a rope loop his neck and tug. He had thought he'd ironed this out, but grief and rage are metals that like to show themselves when heat is applied. "Wait!" Davos called from behind. "Wait, we do this right." "He's there," Jon said. "He's right there." He could see the rooflines he knew as a boy, the smoking teeth of chimneys, the frost rhyming on the leeward sides of tower stones. Umber slid his horse alongside and cuffed Jon's shoulder once. Hard. "Aye, and he knows you're here. Make him look at you from his walls for a night. Make him hear us outside his door. Then we go in through the doors, not flinging ourselves over the roof like fools out of a song." "Siege," Davos said, flat as a table. "Siege," Jon said, and felt something in him agree with the old shape of patience he had learned as a boy from a man who had never rushed unless a child was on a horse going over a ridge too fast. They ringed Winterfell in a thick necklace of men and horses and fires that smoked into the evening. They put fires far enough from the walls that arrows would drop short. They set pickets and rotated men through warmth and watch. Umber and Tormund walked the line like wolves, biting men and slapping them on shoulders, which is the same thing done different. One lay down in a drift that barely came up to his shoulder. He stared at the walls with an expression that would have been difficult to read in a man but was easy in a giant. He was thinking about how to put his hands on the stones and break them, and he was content to think about it until he could do it. Sansa and Rickon came into Jon's tent with snow on their boots and the particular stillness of people who had found a place to put their fear for a few hours. Rickon had a dog now, a lean bitch with a scar on her nose. She followed him in and sat with perfect attention, head tilted. Sansa stood by the brazier with her hands out, palms pale as if newly peeled. "There's a postern gate on the east side," she said without preface. "Old. Father used it when he'd go to the glass gardens before the house woke. It sticks in cold, and you need 3 men to pull it open if it hasn't been used. But it is there." "We'll need more than 3, Davos said. "We'll need a reason for the men on the wall above it to be facing the other way. We'll need a night's worth of quiet in a day that has been noise." "I'll give you noise," Tormund said. "We'll set fires on the western sallyport. Throw dead cattle against the gates. Bang shields, throw insults. If there's one thing men like Ramsay can't stand, it's not being the loudest thing in a room." "Sigorn," Jon asked, "can your men climb?" "We were born to it," Sigorn said, a little proud and a little wary. "But not on slick stone where the arrow falls like rain. Give me a rope inside, and we'll sing you a song." "Then we go before dawn," Jon said. "Umber, set your biggest men at the postern with the strongest arms. Alice, your archers cover them from the south angle. Davos, your best quiet runners take the rope and go with Osha." "With me," Osha said, spinning a knife in her fingers, the point catching lantern light. "The stones in that wall sang to my people once. I can hear their song. I'll go. I know how to hold my breath when weather wants me to breathe." "Ghost goes too," Jon said, and the dire wolf lifted his head as if he had been pretending to sleep only to show his consent. They went when the sky held its breath and the wind forgot what it was doing for a heartbeat. The snow packed under boots without squeaking. The watch on the Winterfell wall had huddled into little lumps with their cloaks drawn up and their noses tucked down. The western sallyport bloomed with sudden commotion. A bonfire sparked to dreadful life with oils the free folk had stored in bladders. A scat sling of insults in 2 languages, horns ridiculous and incessant, beating on shields as if to wake the dead. The east side was quiet as the inside of a church. Osha went first with 2 of Sigorn's leanest, rope wound around they. Our torsos and tied to a stake they had pounded into the packed ground far back so as not to show silhouette. Ghost flowed between them with a gait that looked wrong until you realized it was so right that it threw your mind. He vanished into the dark like a thought you forget as soon as it comes. The men on the wall above the postern coughed, stamped, muttered, turned their heads to the noise elsewhere with longing for the warmth of the fight. Something small clanked inside the gate, old iron waking up. The rope fed out of Davos's hands a foot at a time, quiet as silk. Jon felt his heart in his throat, a ridiculous place for a heart. There was a scrape and a hiss and then a whisper that sounded like a man's dying breath at Jon's ear, but was just a signal Osha had taught them. Once for ready, twice for danger, 3 times for run. He held his own breath till his chest burned. Then the rope tugged in the pattern for ready and the gate shifted a fraction. The men queued, fingers white on leather. Umber murmured something that might have been encouragement or might have been a line of a rude song. The gate moved again. The 3rd time it moved a hand's breadth, and the cold air from inside struck Jon's face like a different winter. "Now," he whispered, and the first 3 slid in sideways with their shields held up like heavy wings. Inside Winterfell they moved through a world Jon knew better than any other. He knew where to put his feet on the flagstones so they wouldn't click. He knew that the corridor by the glass gardens had a hollow sound because of the warmed pipes underneath. He knew the smell of the kitchens would be part onions, part pig fat, part bread if bread could be had. He knew that the old armory door swelled in damp and made a sound like a shrug when it opened. He had learned Winterfell as a boy and the hallways had learned him. Now they tested each other in a different way. They killed 3 men and a boy in the first 6 minutes and took no wounds. Osha's knife did what it had done for years beyond the wall. Went into the place under ribs at an angle that did not allow shouting. Ghost pulled down a guard with a cough of a sound and came away with a mouth like a butcher's apron. Sigorn's men flitted down the rope and began to tie it off places that would hold a grown man's weight. When the first knot was secured, the lean men hauled so that the thicker line tightened, and then Umber's men came up in a grace that no man their size should have possessed, one after another, as if the rope had learned to generate big men out of air. When they reached the inner ward, the noise from the west had grown into a slapping percussion that set dust trembling in the seams of stone. Ramsay had not sent his fire there. He had kept it, perhaps thinking to drink warmth from the chaos himself later. He would be in the great hall, old maps told Jon. He would have chosen the place that let him feel like a lord in a story told badly. They were almost to the oaken doors when a sentry toppled from a stair they had not seen. The man hit the flagstones with noise and a fog of breath and an oath. For a heartbeat the whole hall held its breath, and then the shouts began, and the tidal rumor that is a castle waking to danger roared through. No more point in stealth. Jon threw the door wide, and the men behind him poured through like water breaking a dam. Ramsay had imagined many endings that involved him standing high and clean while others bled. He had not imagined men coming into his hall with winter on their shoulders and blood already soaking their sleeves. He did not panic. Jon learned that in the first blink. Ramsay stepped back and his guards stepped forward, and then everything was noise and iron and meat. Jon found himself face to face not with Ramsay but with a man who had the same smile without the same practice. He cut that smile off and moved on, forcing himself not to look for the gray cloak. He had men behind him who would aim for that and lose their lives in the trying. He had learned something about not throwing good after bad. It was Osha who found Ramsay, in a small iron-fired alcove where scalding water warmed men who had been outside too long. When she lunged, his knife came up with a snake quickness that would have been lovely to see in a dancer. It went under her arm and across her stomach. She made a sound like a question. Ghost hit him a half-breath later, and that saved Osha's second breath. Ramsay went down under an avalanche of white fur and teeth, snarled, slashed, rolled, came up again with blood on his face and something like glee still alive in him because he loved the game even when it broke him. Jon's sword arrived as if it had been called by a bell only he could hear. The blade knocked Ramsay's knife away to clatter skittering under a bench. Ramsay's face changed then. Not fear, not yet, but the first taste of a fear that would grow if given room. "Hello, cousin," Ramsay said, using a word that could be true or false depending on how the gods had played at beds and bastards. "Do you mean to play? I have always wanted to play with you." Jon said nothing. He had learned the value of not feeding the wrong men words. He cut at Ramsay's hand, and then at his knee, and then at his hand again. Ramsay was quick but not strong. He gave ground because the ground behind him was a wall. Ghost stood with his head low, teeth in the brown light. Men yelled in the hall behind them, and then there was a moment of silence, not because the fighting had stopped but because there was a breath between shouts. It was in that breath that Jon's blade went into Ramsay's shoulder with a hard, wet sound and then bit deeper as if the man were made of pork and not cruelty. Ramsay made a noise like laughter turned inside out. He went down on one knee and then two, and then he was on his back with his head at an angle that promised either death or a very long crying. "Dogs," he whispered and smiled, through teeth that already had too much red on them. "Do it, then. Give me to my dogs." "No," Jon said. "You die like a man, not like a mistake with hounds." He raised the blade. For an instant he saw something like a boy in the eyes beneath. A boy who had learned he could make pain and had liked it too much. A boy with no one to tell him that liking pain is like liking salt at a feast. You can drown yourself if you're not careful. Jon's arm came down. The sword did the one thing it was good for. The hall breathed, and then it breathed again without the shape of Ramsay inside it. When they opened Winterfell's gates from within, the morning had barely pushed itself over the horizon. The snow that had fallen in the night looked new again, even though men had bled on it, which is one of the few mercies winter offers the living. The men outside came in as men do when they are both relieved and exhausted, which is to say gracelessly but with gratitude. The fires muttered. The horses shook themselves and shivered their coats into different patterns. Rickon stood between Alice and Umber and watched with an expression that learned something in the space of 3 heartbeats that would take a lifetime to unpack. Sansa came forward with a gait that held her mind and her poise together like a seam. Her hair had come loose and had become a banner of its own. When Jon stepped out into the courtyard, she looked at him and then looked away, then looked again as if to ensure this had not been another story told to someone else's children. "It's done," he said. He meant only the blood and stone. He did not pretend to mean the long tale that would follow. Men always do that part badly when they try to fix it with a single word. "What will you do with their dead?" she asked, quiet. "Bury them," Jon said. "Under the same snow we bury ours. We will count our names and send letters to people who should grieve. We will feed our wounded and burn what can't be cleaned. We will clean everything that can be cleaned. We will close the doors and open them again. We will breathe." She smiled, a small, tired thing with a spark in it. "You sound like father." "I wish I did," he said. "Lord Snow," Alice said, coming up with Sigorn at her side and Umber looming like a bear. "Lady Sansa, we made a knot, you and I. Today it held. Tomorrow we must weave more. Karhold owes Winterfell. The Umbers owe no one but their own word, but they have given it. The free folk owe themselves, but they have given more. We owe the living," Tormund said, thumping his axe down into the packed snow where it stood upright. "And the dead, but the dead will collect their due whether we ask them to or not. The living need more. The living need bread, and knives that won't snap when the cold comes, and a roof that doesn't leak piss onto their children's heads." Davos came forward with a face like a road map of tired. He held a scrap of parchment in his hand with ink still wet. "Ravens go to White Harbor and Torrens Square and houses I wasn't sure would ever listen to us," he said. "They'll listen now. The wind carries news faster than wings. We'll hear other horns soon enough. Some will be welcome, some will be ugly, but they'll blow for us, not against." The words had to be said, and Jon felt the weight of them settle on his collarbones, not like a yoke but like armor. He looked to the old stone and felt the heat of the hot springs coming up under his boots, that old warm breath of Winterfell that had always made the place more animal than building. He thought of the crypt and the long row of kings and lords carved into the rock. He thought of his own mother, a space as empty as a missing tooth in a smile that otherwise was whole. He thought of Rickon's hand gripping Sansa's sleeve, of Alice's bright eyes, of Osha's blood on the stones and her mouth stubborn even in pain. They took stock. The dead were counted. One sat like a mountain in the yard and let a girl with a bowl bandage his leg with a strip torn from a Bolton banner. The free folk spun their own kind of order out of the chaos, which is to say they made a fire, divided meat, told the same story 3 times in different ways, and slept in a pile of blankets that looked like rubbish until you heard the snoring. The Umbers found the cellars and hauled up kegs with grins. The Karstarks walked the walls as if measuring the stones for a dress. In the great hall, Jon stood at the foot of the dais. Sansa went up 2 steps and then stopped, turning her head so the light caught in the copper strands of her hair. Men shuffled and coughed and waited. A boy with a split lip held a flag for his master and watched their faces like a game board. Rickon sat on the second stair with his chin in his hands, eyes wide and full of things that might grow into understanding or might grow into something else if not tended. "The North has had too many kings," Umber said, as if talking dully to himself, and the hall boomed a small laugh because it needed to. "Kings are for stories. We need a man to put his hand on the scales and keep them honest." "A lord of Winterfell," Alice said, clearer. "And a lady, too." Davos's eyes went to Sansa and then to Jon and then to Sansa again, in the way of a man who has learned that sometimes a better thing is not the obvious one. Jon waited, throat dry. He had not wanted a crown since he'd learned how badly crowns fit men like him. He had not wanted to hold the North in his hand like a bird and worry he might crush it, or let it go in surprise when it struggled and then watch it disappear. But he wanted to keep it safe. He wanted that more than he feared a name. "I cannot keep Winterfell alone," Sansa said, and the curve of her mouth had something like apology in it, or maybe just honesty. "Nor should I. The blood of the Starks runs in our family more ways than the gods thought to count. The North is many houses. It is many ways of living. We have forced them to. Oh, be simple, and they have broken. Let them be themselves and bind them with things that do not break. Let the Lord of Winterfell care for the walls and the wells and the bread. Let the Lady of Winterfell care for the other things a house needs. The names, the accounts, the ways women stay alive in winters men make worse. If we do this together, we may keep more children alive than if we do it apart." "Who then?" Umber said, as a man is made to say in such halls. And half the hall looked to Jon as if pulled by a string and half to Sansa as if drawn by a bird's song. Rickon stood up. It was foolish to let a boy speak in a hall made of men hungry for a reason to snap, but sometimes foolishness is the only thing that changes the way a room breathes. "We are the pack," he said, in a voice that would have been lost if the room had not fallen utterly quiet. "A pack runs with a leader, but a pack stays alive because the sisters bite the heels of the brother who runs too far, and because the biggest brother doesn't eat all the meat. I want to grow up. I can't do that if I'm dead. I won't be dead if my brother and my sister make decisions together. Children cut through better than horns." Men who had never listened to their own wives listened to that. The silence that followed had weight, but it was not heavy. It was like snow packed down by many boots, ready to hold weight. Umber nodded, once, as if at a spear thrown straight. "I," he said, "the pack." He lifted his hand, and this time, when his voice carried it, had no doubt in it. "The Lord of Winterfell, the Lady of Winterfell." The hall did the rest. There were no crowns. There were hands, many hands, and voices that had sung about their dead the night before and now had to learn to sing about the living. Jon felt men thump his shoulders and smelled the hot metal smell of their armors and the old wool smell of their cloaks. He felt Sansa's hand in his, small and dry and stronger than it had any right to be. He felt the kitchen fires lift and the walls lean in. He felt one's rumble, the sound a mountain might make when a small bird lands on it. Later, in the quiet that comes when joy is too tired to move, Jon stood alone in the empty hall and listened to the stones. Ghost stretched and yawned and thumped his tail twice. The hot springs murmured under the floor, their old song. He could see the shape of roads that now must be walked, food counted, men stationed, letters sent to houses that had not yet decided how to forget their hurts, blankets made by lamplight, girls taught where to go when the snow came through the rafters, boys taught that a spear is not a toy, old men asked for their memories about winters that had eaten whole years and left teeth marks on the next ones. He saw the white not far off, not Ramsay's banners but something else, the cold wall of a wind no man could stop, a tide of death with blue eyes and no songs. He saw that and wanted to sit. Then he thought about the rope at the postern gate, and the knot at Carhold, and the way Umber had stood with his men when horses shattered against them like waves against a cliff. He thought of Osha's knife and the way she had smiled even when blood was hot on her hands. He thought of Sansa's voice when she cut the world into the pieces that mattered and the ones that did not. He did not sit. He turned and went out to the yard. The night had thickened and softened and smelled of smoke and horse. Sansa stood by a post with her head tipped back, eyes closed, letting the snow touch her face. Rickon had fallen asleep on a bench with the dog a warm curl at his feet. "We did not slaughter the North to get Winterfell back," Sansa said without opening her eyes. "We could have. There were moments when I wanted to, a little, because it would have been faster, and because sometimes I am tired of the slow hard way. But we did not. That matters." "It does," Jon said. "We will need men who have not exhausted their souls when the others come." "Do you still say the others as if it's a story?" she asked, a small tease at the edge of the question, and he surprised himself by laughing, a crack in the ice. "I have seen them," he said, "and sometimes, when I am tired, I still call them a story because the other name hurts my tongue." He glanced out at the walls where Karstarks and Umbers walked together under torches. The sight sent a flicker of something that was not quite hope through him. "But they are not a story, and neither are we." Sansa opened her eyes and snowflakes caught in her lashes. They named him and they named her and then they named the work. Upstairs and down, inside and out. A rope threaded through a gate no one had used in a generation. A knot tied between houses that had been cut apart by blood and winter and arrogance. A pack that had nearly been scattered howling into the dark, nosing root and rot, now crowding together under a wall that breathed warmth into their bones again. The night deepened. Ravens shuffled on their perches in the rookery and muttered to themselves in a language with more croaks than words. Men drank responsibly and irresponsibly both, and no one flayed anyone. In the glass gardens, where frost had long taken the tender things and left only the hardy behind their fogged panes, a child touched her finger to a pane and drew a clumsy wolf in condensation and laughed at how it distorted as it melted. At the gate where Osha had bled and smiled, a watchman stamped his feet and blew on his hands and told a story to stay awake. It was a story about a boy under a table and the way dogs know a good heart when they see one. It was a story about a big man and a bigger, colder day, and how they both bent but did not break. It was a story that would get better in the telling, as stories should when they belong to more than one person. And beyond the walls, past the warm skin of Winterfell, the cold breathed in and out as it always had and always would, and the world turned under it as best it could. And for a little while that night, there were more hearts beating in time than beating alone. That had to be enough. For a little while it was. In the next days, letters winged to houses with names that tasted like iron and old wood. Serwyn, Ryswell, Manderley, Hornwood. Some answered with the speed of men who had been waiting in their bones for a sign. Some waited to see who else would foolishly leap into cold water first. There were meetings in smoke-stained rooms where old grudges were laid out like knives on a table and looked at with the weary eye you give a tool that has done too much work and no longer holds an edge. There were gifts given, small and large. A cart of barley flour. A smith willing to spend his winter at Winterfell shaping rivets with numb hands until the lines of fists waiting at his door were shorter. A singer who knew the old words and the new tune. A priest of the old gods who did not preach but stood under a tree and let men listen to the wind. Lady Alice took a room in the East Tower that had known many winters and made it hers with sheets of woven gray and black, and the small ferocious laugh that came out of her when Sigorn told a joke from beyond the wall that did not translate into Southern. The Karstark men learned to drink with Thens and not wake up naked on the wrong roof. The Umbers found the kennels and were happier for it. Jon found the yard every morning and swung a blade until his shoulder sang and then taught boys that a sword is not a broom, that you don't wave it to clean the world. Sansa found the places where women sit and trade the daily power. She went through accounts made in cramped winter hands and saw where the grain dipped and knew the size of the spoon that should be set out in houses with more children than coin. She met with a woman from a village in the Wolfswood who could cure a cough with a syrup she made of onions and honey and herb that grew under the snow if you knew where to look. She went to the glass gardens and asked what would grow when the sun gave up for a month and a half. She kept the quills set out in the solar and ink warm enough to flow and showed Rickon where to place his hand when he practiced the letters of his name. He grumbled and pretended to hate it and then looked secretly proud when the letters came right. She spoke quietly with Brienne of Tarth when the tall woman arrived with a sword that had tasted worse winters and a face that did not plan to leave Sansa's side until the season changed twice. She spoke a little less quietly with Peter Baelish, and then not at all when she realized the cost of that conversation would be counted in blood she refused to spend. She spoke to Jon in the evenings and they planned. They were not always kind to each other and they did not always agree, but they were careful of the places that were raw. Ghost took to patrolling the walls when the moon was thin, and once he came back with a scrape along his ribs that Jon rubbed ointment into while the direwolf made a sound like a hearth thinking about going out. Rickon watched with solemn eyes, and then put his small hand on Ghost's head, and whispered a word that was not a command but a prayer. The dog with the scar nose put her head against Rickon's shin and looked at Ghost with respect. Dogs understand a pecking order without meetings. News traveled. The foes to the south and the storms to the north both stirred. Men spoke the name of a queen across the sea. Men spoke the name of a boy on a dragon in stories made for children to bargain sleep from the cold. Northmen polished their axes and argued about soup. Letters came from the wall with the spare syllables of the watch, and Jon ran his finger along the words until he felt the rough letter of an old oath trough under his skin. He rode to the Grove of Nine at dusk more often than he told anyone. The faces in the trees never changed and always did. He could tell the weather from the shape of their shadows. On a morning when the sky was white as milk and the world was all sound with no sight, a bundle was brought to the hall wrapped in rough linen. It had the sad heaviness of an animal that has stopped. When they opened it, it was Osha's knife. The leather behind the handle had been worn smooth by her hand and stained with things that would never wash out. The man who brought it was from the kitchen, a breaker of bones for stew pots, who had found it under the bench in the iron warming alcove while looking for a dropped spoon. Jon took the knife. He went to the yard and put it on a post and said nothing. One tapped the post once with a finger as big as a ladle. Men stood in silence, each with a different memory for a woman whose life had been a long series of choices made with knives. Spring would not come quickly. It would have to be forced open like a gate stuck in old rust. But Winterfell had men and women in it now who had the right kind of shoulders for pushing. The house had a lord and a lady who had learned that dividing work is not dividing love. It had a boy who would learn to love letters as much as sticks. It had a great, patient beast with white fur and eyes that saw past men and through them. It had fires in the kitchens and people who knew what to do with bones when the meat was gone. It had banners in the rafters that meant the same thing to more men than they had meant the day before. When the cold came down in practice instead of theory, when the dead came walking the roads where once only wolves had stalked, Winterfell would be what it had always been at its best. A place where people held each other against a storm that no one can stop but many can survive together. And before that storm, before the white everywhere, there was this. A man standing on a wall he'd known since he was a boy, a woman in a solar with a quill she did not drop when her fingers went numb, a boy running with a dog across a yard that had learned his steps, a giant lying in a drift with a blanket that was a cut-down sail from a ship on a southern sea, a free folk leader making crude jokes to keep his men warm, an Umber and a Karstark teaching each other games where you win by not winning, a blade on a post catching an edge of pale light as the sun tried to remember what it knew. The wind sang in the stones. Ghost lifted his head and listened. Jon put his hand on the rough winter of the parapet and breathed in, breathed out. He felt the knot hold. He felt the pack gather. He felt the long road behind and the longer road ahead. He did not bless it or curse it. He did not ask it for favor. He simply stepped onto it and began.